I've always been a sucker for solitude. That's why I started hiking in the first place. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the hume of streetlights and the constant ping of my phone, gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. That's how I found myself deep in the Appalachian Mountains, camera slung over my shoulder, chasing the perfect sunset. I'd seen a photo online, a breathtaking shot of the Blue Ridge peaks bathed in fiery orange and deep violet. I wanted one of my own. I had planned everything, a few hours up the trail, a couple of quick snaps, and then back before the sun disappeared completely. Easy. The path was marked, though not well-traveled, winding up through thick woods and rocky outcrops. The air was warm but crisp, the kind that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. It was perfect. Until the fog rolled in. At first, it was just a thin veil, nothing unusual for the mountains. I didn't think much of it. But within minutes, it thickened, dense and cloying, swallowing the trail behind me. It was like watching a wave of smoke roll in, silent and deliberate. The sky above was still clear, the sun barely starting to dip behind the ridges, but around me, the world was turning into a gray, shapeless void. I should have turned back right then. Instead, I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not surprising out here, but still unsettling. I tried to shake the creeping unease building in my stomach. It's just fog, I told myself, just weather. I kept moving forward, slower now, watching the trail markers closely. Then I heard it. Ah. A soft rustling in the mist. I stopped, listening. Probably just a rabbit or a squirrel. The mountains were full of wildlife. But something about the way the sound moved made me uneasy. It wasn't a single noise. It was all around me, soft, shifting, as if something was circling. I turned, trying to see beyond the dense gray curtains surrounding me. That's when I noticed them. Eyes, not one pair, not two, a dozen. Maybe more, faint glowing, scattered through the fog like tiny lanterns. At first, I thought I was imagining it, light reflecting off moisture in the air, a trick of the mind, but they were real. And they weren't blinking. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air crawled up my spine. I told myself they were animals, maybe deer, maybe something else, but deep down, I knew animals blink. Silence pressed in on me, thick and unnatural. Even the birds had gone quiet. I took a step back, my foot crunching against gravel. The eyes didn't move, they just watched. Then came the growl. Loud, guttural, vibrating through the fog. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My hands clenched around my camera strap, the plastic digging into my palms. And then, movement. The eyes shifted, slowly at first, then faster. The rustling grew louder. Footsteps, not one, many, moving in tandem, closing in. Something inside me snapped. I turned and ran. The trail was gone, swallowed by the mist. My heart hammered as I stumbled over rocks and tree roots, my breath ragged. The sound behind me grew more frantic. Shuffling, scraping, something large moving in the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. The fog twisted around me, disorienting, suffocating. I couldn't see 5 feet ahead. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think, but panic had taken control. A sharp snap to my right. Something moving fast. My instincts screamed, "Run faster!" I did. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, legs aching. The growls grew louder, closer. I could hear them now. Multiple, deep, guttural, impossible to tell how many. And then, just when I thought I was done for, the fog lifted. Not all at once. Slowly, as if whatever had brought it was retreating. The trees sharpened into focus. The trail appeared beneath my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled forward, nearly collapsing into a small clearing. The silence was deafening. I turned, expecting to see something. But the mist had pulled back into the trees, curling at the edges of the clearing like fingers. And the eyes? Gone. But I knew they were still there, watching. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, as if the mountain was pretending everything was normal again. I forced myself to move, step by shaky step, back to the trail. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I finally made it back to the parking lot, the sun had long since set. There were a few other hikers loading up their gear, laughing, completely unaware of what had just happened up in the hills. I wanted to tell them, warn them, but what would I say? That I saw eyes in the fog? That I ran from something I never actually saw? That the silence in the woods felt too alive? They would have laughed. I would have laughed too. So I said nothing. But I never went back. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I still see them, glowing in the dark, floating. I know how these stories sound. They start the same way. Someone looking for a little peace, a little escape, something beautiful in the wilderness. And they always end the same way too, with something that doesn't quite fit. Something that lingers in the dark corners of your mind long after you've come back to civilization. I heard James Carter's story about the fog and the eyes, and it stuck with me. Not just because of what he saw, but because I had my own story to tell. Something I haven't spoken about since that night. Something I wish I could forget. I was camping in the Black Hills National Forest, far from any major roads or campsites. I liked it that way. I wasn't there for a casual weekend trip. I was there to work. I teach high school biology, and I was doing research on native plant species for a curriculum project. That meant long days of hiking, collecting samples, and long nights alone in the woods. It never bothered me before. In fact, I enjoyed it. The solitude, the quiet. But after what happened, I haven't camped alone since. That night, I had just finished setting up my tent near a creek. It was a beautiful spot. Tall pines stretching high above, their dark silhouettes swaying gently in the breeze. The only sound was the soft trickle of water over the rocks. It felt safe, peaceful. I made a small fire, ate my dinner, and leaned back against my pack, staring at the stars through the gaps in the trees. Then I heard it. A cough. It wasn't loud, just a small, dry sound, like someone clearing their throat. At first, I barely registered it. Maybe the wind rustling through the trees had played a trick on my ears. But then it came again, closer this time. I sat up, suddenly alert. I hadn't seen another person all day. The nearest trailhead was miles away. I clicked on my flashlight and swept it over the trees beyond my campfire. Nothing but the endless dark trunks of the pines, their branches shifting softly in the wind. I told myself it was an animal, a fox maybe, or a deer. I turned back to the fire, poking at the embers to push away the unease creeping up my spine. But then I heard the whispering. It came from the trees. Soft, low, multiple voices murmuring at once. I froze. My hand tightened around the flashlight. The whispers were close, but I couldn't make out any words. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything I recognized. Just the low hum of voices speaking in a rhythm that felt ancient, wrong somehow, like something I wasn't meant to hear. I stood slowly, shining the light toward the source of the sound. The whispers stopped immediately. The only thing moving was the wind through the trees. Then the cough came again. Right behind me, I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The fire flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. My pulse pounded in my ears. I couldn't see anyone, I couldn't see anything, but I knew, without a doubt, I wasn't alone. A chill crawled over my skin. I forced myself to take slow, measured steps toward my tent. I needed to get inside, zip it up, pretend none of this was happening. I could leave at first light. Then something sharp sliced across my shoulder. I gasped, stumbling forward. My flashlight dropped to the ground, the beam spinning wildly as it landed. My hand shot up to my shoulder, expecting to feel something solid, something real, but there was nothing. Just a shallow, burning pain, like I'd been grazed by something impossibly thin. And then, right against my ear, a voice whispered, "Don't turn around." I didn't. I wanted to. My body screamed for me to look, to see what was there, but something deeper, something primal inside me knew better. I bolted. I didn't stop to grab my pack, my samples, or my gear. I just ran. The whispering swelled behind me, growing louder, frantic, the voices overlapping in a chaotic chant. The trees blurred past me as I tore through the underbrush, branches whipping against my face and arms. My feet barely touched the ground. I expected something to grab me, to yank me back into the dark, but nothing did. When I finally broke through the tree line and reached my car, I didn't hesitate. I wrenched the door open, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I barely managed to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I peeled out of there, gravel spraying as I sped down the narrow dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station for nearly an hour, my breathing ragged, my mind racing, before I finally checked my shoulder in the bathroom mirror. There was a thin, red line across my skin, no deeper than a scratch, but it hadn't been there before. And the worst part? It was perfectly straight, like something had traced it with precision. The next day, I went back with the Rangers. I needed to know. We hiked to my campsite together. When we arrived, my tent was still there. My gear was untouched. Nothing was out of place except for one thing, a bloody handprint smeared across the side of my tent. It wasn't mine. I left everything behind. My samples, my equipment, I didn't care. I got in my car and drove away, and I haven't been back to those woods since. Sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that whisper, "Don't turn around." And I wonder what would have happened if I had. It's funny how stories like these seem to find each other. James Carter and his fog, Lisa Moreno and the whispers. I heard both of their stories after the fact, and when I did, something inside me twisted in recognition. Because I knew that feeling, that raw, skin-crawling dread when you realize something isn't right. And worse, you have no way to explain it to anyone who wasn't there. That's why I'm telling this now. Well, maybe it'll make a difference, maybe it won't, but if you ever find yourself on a lonely trail and two rangers tell you to turn back, don't listen. I was hiking alone in the Sawtooth Wilderness, Idaho. I'm not some reckless amateur. I've done solo trips for years, and I've always been cautious. This time was no different. The trail was rugged, but nothing I couldn't handle. The sun was high, the air was crisp, and I had the whole day ahead of me. My plan was simple, a 15-mile loop back before dark. The first few hours were uneventful, just me and the sound of my boots crunching over dirt and gravel. The forest was thick in places, but the trail was clear. I hadn't seen a single person all day, which was unusual but not unheard of. I liked the solitude. But then, somewhere around mile 7, I saw them. Two park rangers standing just ahead where the trail curved. I hadn't heard them approach, hadn't noticed them until they were right there, standing side by side. Their uniforms were crisp, too crisp. The green and tan fabric looked brand new, like it had never seen a day of real work. Their boots were spotless, no dust, no mud, nothing. One of them, a tall guy with sharp features, nodded at me. "Hey there," he said, his voice casual but flat. "You're gonna want to turn back. There's been an incident up ahead." I stopped, my breath still steady from the hike, but my pulse suddenly kicking up a notch. "What kind of incident?" The second ranger, shorter and broader, just shook his head. "Nothing you need to worry about. Best if you follow us back down." Something about the way he said it put my nerves on edge. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way they stood, too still, too rigid, like they were waiting for something. I've met a lot of rangers in my time. They're usually relaxed, approachable. These guys weren't. And then I noticed their badges. Blank. Just smooth, silver plates where their names should have been. I felt my stomach clench. That was wrong. That was so wrong. I took a step back. "I think I'll just keep going," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "I know this trail pretty well." The taller one took a step forward. "That's not a good idea." And then he reached out. I don't know why I reacted the way I did, but every instinct in my body screamed, "Move." I jerked back before his fingers could close around my arm, and that's when I felt it. The air around him was cold. Not mountain air cold, but something else. Something unnatural. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I didn't care how stupid I looked, didn't care if they really were rangers and I was overreacting. Every fiber of my being told me I had to get away. I could hear them behind me. Not running, walking. But somehow, they kept pace. Their footsteps were steady, deliberate, always just a few feet behind mine, no matter how fast I moved. And then, the worst part, just talking, their voices calm, murmuring to each other like I wasn't even there. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound of it made my skin crawl. I pushed harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. The trail split ahead. I took the left path without thinking, crashing through branches, almost tripping over a root. I glanced back. They were gone, just like that. The air was still. The forest was silent. I was alone. I stood there, my chest heaving, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. I waited, expecting them to step out of the trees, to keep coming, but nothing happened. For a long time, I just stood there. Then, slowly, I started moving again. I didn't run, but I didn't stop either. I kept my pace steady, listening, waiting. Every crunch of leaves under my boots made my nerves jump, but no one followed. By the time I made it back to my truck, the sun was starting to set. My hands shook as I unlocked the door. I sat there for a long time before I finally turned the engine over and drove straight to the ranger station. I needed answers. When I told them what had happened, the guy behind the desk frowned. "Which trail was this?" I told him. He exchanged a look with another ranger. Then he asked me to describe the two men. I did my best. Tall, sharp features, brand new uniforms, blank badges. As I spoke, I watched his expression darken. "We weren't any rangers on that trail today," he said finally. My mouth went dry. "What?" He shook his head. "We don't have anyone that fits that description, and all our guys are accounted for." I stared at him, waiting for some kind of explanation, some logical answer, but he didn't have one. I left after that, drove home in silence, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but I never did. I don't know who or what they were. But I do know one thing. If I hadn't run when I did, I don't think I would have made it out of those woods. I've heard a lot of stories about the things that lurk in the woods, but I always figured they were just that, stories. Tall tales passed around campfires, warnings meant to keep kids from wandering too far. But then I heard Brian's story about the rangers, the way they weren't quite right, the way they moved too perfectly, their voices too calm, the way he ran because his gut told him to. And suddenly I wasn't so sure these stories were just fiction anymore, because I had my own. It happened 2 years ago, back when I still believed in the silence of the wilderness, back when I thought solitude was safety. I had set up camp in the Washington National Forest, deep enough into the woods that I wouldn't hear a single car, wouldn't see a single person for miles. That was the way I liked it. The world had been too loud for too long, and this was my escape. Just me, my tent, a fire, and the sound of the creek running nearby. I'd been hiking all day. By the time I settled in, the sun had dipped below the treetops, staining the sky a deep orange. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and leaned back against my pack, letting the night settle around me. The air was still warm, but a cool breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I don't know when it started. Maybe I wasn't paying attention, maybe I was too caught up in the stillness, but at some point the usual sounds of the forest just stopped. No crickets, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just silence. I sat up, suddenly uneasy. It wasn't normal. Even at night, the forest should have been alive with noise. Instead, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then came the smell. It hit me out of nowhere. Thick, musty, wrong. Like damp earth, but stronger, heavier. Almost rotten, but not quite. I sniffed the air, trying to place it, but there was nothing around that should have smelled like that. A shiver ran through me, and I told myself to stop being stupid. Maybe a dead animal somewhere nearby. Maybe just the scent of the creek, shifting with the wind. Nothing to worry about. But then I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over the dry leaves just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart hammering. I wasn't the kind of guy who scared easy, but something about this didn't sit right. I swept the beam through the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. Just endless black trunks stretching into the night. I exhaled, shaking my head. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd been out here alone too long. Then something moved. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, past the trees, a shadow. Tall. Too tall. It wasn't walking, it was shifting, sliding between the trunks like smoke. Like it wasn't quite solid. My throat tightened. I aimed the flashlight straight at it, expecting it to disappear like a trick of the eye. But it didn't. It stopped. And it stared. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any features. Just a black, twisted shape standing unnaturally still. A cold wave of dread washed over me, and for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never truly felt before. Fear. Then, my tent moved. Something pushed against it from the inside. I whipped around, my mind barely able to process what was happening. The fabric bulged outward as if something was trying to press its way through. My blood turned to ice. I had been sitting by the fire the whole time. I hadn't been in the tent, so what the hell was inside it? Before I could react, the entire tent collapsed. Something slammed into it with a force that sent the fabric folding in on itself, knocking over my gear. The firelight flickered wildly, casting long, jerky shadows. And then, a hand. A rotting, blackened hand shot out from beneath the fabric. Long fingers, skin peeling, reaching. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The thing under my tent moved, pushing, twisting, trying to force its way out. And then the shadow in the trees started moving again. It didn't walk, it glided. Too fast. Too smooth, straight toward me. Panic hit me like a freight train. I grabbed the first thing I could, my pocket knife, and slashed at the tent. The blade cut through the fabric easily, but there was nothing inside. No body, no creature, just empty, crumpled nylon. But the hand had been real. I knew it had. The shadow was almost at the fire now. My legs finally listened, and I ran. I ran so fast I didn't even think about where I was going, didn't care if I tripped over roots or fell into the creek. My only thought was, get away. Behind me, I could still hear it, the sound of something massive moving through the trees, following. Not running, just coming. I made it to the trail. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I saw my truck. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there, chest heaving, staring at the dark tree line. Nothing came out, nothing followed. I sat there until the sun came up, too afraid to close my eyes. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back, the campsite was gone. The tent, my gear, even the fire pit. Like I had never been there at all. The only thing left was the smell, that thick, musty, rotting smell. I haven't camped alone since, and I never will again. I've always been fascinated by stories of the wilderness. The ones people whisper in hushed voices. The ones that make you question what's really out there when the sun sets and the world turns dark. I thought they were just that, stories, cautionary tales, old legends passed down to keep hikers wary. But then I heard Nathan's story, the thing that had followed him, the way his entire campsite had vanished, like he had never been there at all. And I realized something. I had my own story to tell. I had been in Vermont, deep in the Green Mountains, conducting field research on owl populations. It was supposed to be a simple, straightforward study, documenting behavior, tracking nesting sites, recording calls. I'd done it a dozen times before. I wasn't scared of the woods. If anything, they felt like home. That night, I set up camp near a dense patch of trees, far from the nearest town. No artificial lights, no distant sounds of traffic, just me, my tent, and the rhythmic calls of the owls. It was perfect. The fire crackled as I sat with my field notes, jotting down observations. The wind rustled gently through the leaves, peaceful. Then I heard it. Laughter, faint, distant, high-pitched like children playing. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. I was miles from the nearest house, and there were no trails nearby, no campsites, no reason for children to be out here. But the laughter came again, soft, giggling, just beyond the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, shining it into the dark. Hello? Silence. I took a step forward, my boots crunching over the fallen leaves. The forest was still, too still. No wind, no owls. Just an expectant silence pressing against my ears. Then something moved, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast for me to catch more than a glimpse. Small, child-sized. My breath hitched. Another giggle, closer this time. I swept the flashlight in an arc, my pulse quickening. "Who's there?" No response. Just the rustling of leaves, the faint scuff of footsteps in the dirt. Then I saw them. Figures darting through the trees, barely visible in the weak beam of my flashlight. They were pale, thin, their faces obscured by the darkness, their movements too quick, too unnatural. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back toward my tent, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could take another step, a voice, small, soft, whispered from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." I whipped around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The voice had been right behind me, but there was nothing there. Then something yanked my backpack, hard. I stumbled forward, gasping, nearly dropping my flashlight. I spun, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. The forest was still empty, no movement, no figures. But the straps of my backpack had been pulled so tight they dug into my shoulders. Then another whisper. "Stay with us." It was right in my ear. I bolted, I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. My breath ragged. I didn't care where I was going, only that I was getting away. But the laughter followed. It wasn't behind me anymore, it was all around me. A chorus of giggles, circling, growing louder, overlapping, surrounding me in a dizzying, sickening cacophony. My flashlight beam shook wildly as I ran, casting erratic shadows through the trees. My mind screamed at me to keep moving, to get to my car, to get out of these woods now. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the laughter stopped. Silence. I didn't stop running, not until I reached my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped them. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. My breath came in heaving gasps as I stared into the tree line. The woods were still. Nothing moved. Then my radio crackled, a burst of static followed by a voice. My own voice, repeating words I had spoken earlier in the day. "Who's there?" The blood drained from my face. I jammed the key into the ignition, my heart hammering as the truck roared to life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove until I was miles away, not daring to slow down until I reached the nearest town. The next morning, I went back. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof that it had happened. Maybe I needed to convince myself that it hadn't, but when I got there, my tent was untouched, my gear exactly where I had left it, like nothing had ever happened. Except for one thing. Tiny handprints, covering the windows of my truck. There's something about the wilderness that makes you think you're alone when you're not, that tricks you into believing that if you can't see it, it can't see you. But that's never been true, has it? Ava's story haunted me. The way the laughter followed her, the handprints on her car, the voices mimicking her own words. It made me think about what I had experienced, about the reason I stopped chasing the past. Because sometimes the past doesn't want to be found. Sometimes it finds you. I had spent years researching forgotten places, ruins, ghost towns, abandoned buildings. It was an obsession, a hunger to uncover lost history. That's how I ended up at the old fire tower, deep in Jefferson National Forest. I had read about it in an obscure journal entry from the 1950s, built in the 1930s, built in the 1930s, decommissioned in the 80s. Officially, it was closed due to structural instability, but there were stories. People who went in and didn't come out. Hikers who claimed they saw something moving at the top, even though the stairs had long since rotted away. I had to see it for myself. I drove for hours, then hiked another 6 miles to reach it. The tower loomed in the clearing, skeletal and rusted, its wooden stairs creaking in the wind. The trees around it were dead, their bark split and gray. The air smelled stale, like old wood and something else. Something wrong. I hesitated at the base, tilting my head back. The top cabin was still intact, just a black silhouette against the evening sky. I felt it then, unease I couldn't place, like the trees themselves were watching. I shook it off and started climbing. The stairs groaned beneath my weight, brittle with decay. Dust swirled in the fading light, disturbed by my movements. I counted each step, my breath steady, my grip firm on the rusted railing. Halfway up, I heard a noise. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Somewhere above me, I stopped, my pulse spiking. The wind, I told myself, a loose board shifting, but it wasn't random. It had a pattern. I kept climbing. The higher I went, the thicker the air became, heavy like a thunderstorm about to break. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't wind, it was fingers on metal. I reached the top and stepped into the cabin. Dust coated the floor in thick layers. The windows were cracked, streaked with grime. A desk sat in the corner, papers still scattered across its surface like someone had just left. And then I saw the logbook. I brushed the dust away and flipped it open. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, documenting weather conditions, animal sightings, mundane observations. Then the entries changed. The shadows are moving again. I see the eyes. I see the eyes began watching from the tree line. No one else can see it. The stairs don't go where they should anymore. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. Then, the final entry. I hear it breathing. A board creaked behind me. I spun, my flashlight flickering. The doorway was empty. The stairs stretched down into darkness, but the tapping hadn't stopped. It was coming from inside the room. I swept the flashlight around. The beam caught the desk, the empty windows, the warped floorboards. Nothing. But the sound was right there. Then I felt it. A slow, warm breath against the back of my neck. I turned too fast, my foot catching on a loose board. I stumbled, the flashlight slipping from my grip, bouncing once before rolling to the edge of the platform. The beam pointed down the stairwell, and that's when I saw it. Not a shadow, not a person. Something wrong. It crouched on the steps just below me, its limbs too long, too thin, its skin was stretched too tight, its fingers curled against the railing. And its eyes? They weren't eyes at all. They were just holes, empty black voids that swallowed the light. It was smiling. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. Then it spoke. My voice. He came. He ran. He'll be back. A perfect guttural mimic. The thing lunged. I didn't think. I bolted, throwing myself down the stairs, nearly slipping as my boots skidded over rotted wood. The tapping exploded into pounding footsteps. Too fast, too heavy, it was right behind me. I hit the last step and sprinted into the trees, my lungs burning. My heart beat a deafening roar. The forest blurred around me, branches slashing at my arms, my legs. I didn't stop, didn't look back, not until I reached my car. The fire tower was still there, silent, dark. The thing was gone, but I knew it was watching. The next day I went back. I had to. But when I reached the clearing, the tower was different. The windows were gone. The top cabin had collapsed decades ago, and the logbook, nowhere to be found, except for a single, fresh entry scratched into the rusted metal of the door. He came. He ran. He'll be back. If there's one thing I've learned from these stories, mine and the others, it's this. The wilderness is never truly empty. You can convince yourself that solitude is safety, that silence means peace. But sometimes, when the wind dies down and the forest holds its breath, something else is listening, watching, waiting. Each of these encounters started with the same mistake, thinking we were alone. James believed the fog was nothing more than an eerie weather shift, a temporary veil between him and the rest of the world. Lisa thought the whispers were just tricks of the wind, something easily explained. Brian trusted the men in uniform, assuming that logic would keep him safe. Nathan felt secure in his campsite, confident that fire and steel were enough to protect him. Ava ignored the laughter, refusing to acknowledge the unnatural nature of it until it was too late. And I was foolish enough to go looking for answers in a place that never wanted to be found. If there's a lesson to be learned, it's this: trust your instincts. If the air feels too still, if the shadows seem too deep, if your gut tells you to turn back, listen. Logic won't always save you. There are things out there that don't follow the rules of our world, things that don't belong in the daylight. The moment you try to rationalize them, you give them a chance to prove you wrong. And if you ever find yourself in the mountains when the fog rolls in, or camping by a creek when the whispers start, don't stay. Because not everyone who disappears in the woods gets to come back. With that said, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here, for listening, for stepping into the unknown with me, one story at a time. Your support keeps this channel alive, keeps these stories from fading into the void. So if you've ever had an experience like these, something you can't explain, share it. Let the world know. And remember, the wild doesn't forget. Until next time, keep your lights on, your eyes open, and your instincts sharp. Instagram live, because you never know what might be watching from just beyond the trees. This is Enigma of the Unknown, signing off. Stay safe.